Earlier, we configured an AWS policy which enables the add-on to talk to the AWS API. Now we have to configure some services so that they make data available for the add-on to read. Let's cover the steps to set up AWS Cloudtrail. With the Splunk add-on for AWS version 4.3 and 4.4, we introduced a much better, much more scalable way of processing Cloudtrail, even config data. And that's via what we call SQS-based S3 input. This also applies to other sources like ELB logs, ALB logs, CloudFront logs, and so on. But the way it basically works is Cloudtrail first gets enabled in step 1. We enable writing the data to an S3 bucket. And in step 2, within that S3 bucket, then we go and configure what we call a notification to an SQS queue. The Splunk add-on basically subscribes to that SQS queue. So it knows whenever there's an update, and then it goes and fetches those changes or those updates later on. There's also this concept of a dead letter queue, because what happens if you have error messages? They'll just stay in the SQS queue by default, and the Splunk add-on will keep polling and thinking there are new events, and they'll just get registered as errors every time. So we need a place to put these error messages outside of this queue that the Splunk add-on is subscribing to. That's what's called a dead. Here are the steps to actually set up Cloudtrail now, and what we really have to do is think backwards looking at this diagram. So first we need to create the dead letter queue. Then we create the real queue that the add-on is going to subscribe to. And then we can configure Cloudtrail. And in Cloudtrail, we're going to tell it write to an S3 bucket. And from there, we're also going to go back into the queue and update permissions so that this S3 bucket can actually send notifications to it. So the steps are all laid out right here. The main thing to consider here, or just to remember, for the regular queue, you need a visibility timeout of 5 minutes and a max receive of 1 under read drive policy. Also, in the S3 configuration, for it to send notifications to SQS queue, we're going to select Object Create All. Following the steps we just laid out to set up Cloudtrail, we first have to create the 2 SQS queues. So we go under Messaging, Simple Queuing Service within our AWS console, and we're going to create 2 new queues. First one is a dead letter queue. It's a standard queue, doesn't require any special configuration or extra config, so we're just going to do quick create queue. But now the next one is going to require some special configs. So this is the SQS queue that the S3 bucket will send notifications to. So here we're going to call this SQS and configure queue this time. Here, default visibility timeout needs to be at least 5 minutes or 300 seconds. And then we're going to do a use read drive policy and specify that dead letter queue we just created. And the maximum receives, we want this to be no more than 1. If you have it more than 1, you can have multiple of the same errors appear on the Splunk side, and it might indicate to you or lead you to believe that you have a bigger problem than you do. And then the dead letter queue, this is where it's a hit or miss for me. As you type, it should pick up other queues that you have created. If it doesn't, it means that you haven't waited long enough, so you might have to come back later and update this. For now, I'm just going to use one of the existing ones that I've already created and create queue. And so now any error messages will go into this Cloudtrail dead letter from this YouTube SQS. We'll come back in here also in a minute and cover permissions. Next step is to configure Cloudtrail itself and enable a trail. So we go to Cloudtrail, Trails, Create Trail. And in this case, apply trail to all regions is acceptable. In the past, with the prior setup, we recommended a no, but this one is more flexible with the SQS-based S3 inputs. All write read events, and there's also in the AWS console a new feature here where you can log S3 bucket access as Cloudtrail logs, so you can enable that if you like. But down here, create a new S3 bucket, and we're going to call this YouTube-Cloudtrail. And let's see, this was created earlier and deleted, but let's see if it takes it. Create. And at this point, it's created the S3 bucket, and it's pointing all of the data into there. Now, we need to go and make an update here to our SQS queue so that we can do the next step. We need to update the permissions here. So we're going to go back in here, select this YouTube SQS, go to permissions, and notice if I click on add a permission, I only have principals and what those principals can do that I can select from here. So I can either do everybody and all SQS actions, or at least a write send message. Or what I need to do in order to limit it to just a specific S3 bucket is create a policy. So I have to do edit policy document, and I have to paste a policy in here that limits access to an S3 bucket. And for that, this is where I leverage the wealth of information in AWS documentation. In this particular document that is within this URL right here that I just found through a Google search, I have example of an IAM policy that you attach to a destination SQS queue. So let's copy this. And another note here, I have better luck copying by highlighting the text versus clicking on the copy. That's a no-no here that has resulted in some errors in my history. So copy this, go back to our configuration for SQS here, paste this in here, and then the only thing we have to change here is the bucket name. So the bucket name started with YouTube, so we can just do YouTube wildcard. So any YouTube bucket name that starts with that, we'll be able to write to this queue and or notify this queue. Review policy, it likes it, save changes. At this point, we can now go into our S3 bucket. And here it is, YouTube Cloudtrail, that was created when we were within the Cloudtrail trail. And at this point, we want to click on the S3 bucket name. We want to go to Properties, and we want to come down here to Events. So click on Events, add notification, give it a name, and actions or events, you want to do object create all. Object create all. And you're going to send to SQS queue, select that queue we created earlier, so that was the YouTube SQS queue, and save. If there were any permission issues, you would have had an error in that last step. So because we took care of it, we applied a policy at the SQS level, we did not get an error within the screen. And that's it for configuring Cloudtrail through SQS-based S3 input on the AWS side. Now that you've configured the AWS side, enabled Cloudtrail, you're ready to configure the Splunk side. And that's a relatively easy process of just coming into the add-on, going into inputs, and then we're going to create a new input of Cloudtrail type. We did an SQS-based S3, which is a recommended one, and then you'll have a screen pop up similar to this one here, and then you just fill in the blanks. Here is one I already have completed previously. And so with that, we just have the account. We have the region that's populated, as well as a queue, and that's it. And then once that's saved, you can then validate that you have data coming into Splunk. You can either go look at your Splunk app for AWS and see if there's any notable Cloudtrail activity that has popped up in here. Also, what I like to do is just open a search in another window here. So source type equals AWS Cloudtrail, and see what events have come in. You can also change this to all-time, real-time, or 1-minute window and see what events are streaming in that are Cloudtrail related.